Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast. I will be your host today. My name is Tavia Vital. I'm a registered nurse and certified diabetes care and education specialist with Integrated Diabetes Services. And I am excited to be joined by none other than Gary Scheiner. Gary, will you introduce yourself?
Well, you didn't share the most exciting and fun part about you.
Which is, do I want to know what you're going to say?
No, I mean, you and your son live with type 1 diabetes for a long time.
A very long time.
Instant cred.
Yeah, street cred. And because I got to make it one more year with this fun thing, then I get to go up one tick on my year count. So I'm at 48 years and counting myself. And then my son, who is 18, he is past the 5-year mark and counting. So yes, living with type 1 diabetes personally.
You got me beat. Yeah. I just passed my 41 years with type 1.
Congratulations.
It inspired me to get into this field.
Yeah.
So, no looking back now. I've been a diabetes care and education specialist for over 30 years and run my own practice. It's grown nicely, added some amazing staff, clinical people like you to the team, and kind of a fitness fanatic. I work out every day. I'm sports minded. You'll see I use a lot of sports analogies in my descriptions and discussions, and they may fly over some people's heads, but too bad. I like using them anyway.
Sometimes they sink in after the fact, and that's okay too, because then I get to laugh later, and that's all right with me.
I try to read people, and I may have to call an audible at the last minute. That's a sports analogy right there. Calling an audible.
All right. So today we are going to focus a little bit on one of the most important chapters of your Think Like a Pancreas book. We're going to look at chapter 3 specifically, which is Fun with Fundamental.
Welcome to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, where our goal is to keep you informed, inspired, and a little entertained on all things diabetes. The information contained in this program is based on the experience and opinions of the Integrated Diabetes Services clinical team. Please discuss any changes to your treatment plan with your personal healthcare provider before implementing.
So should we start sort of in the beginning with really the types of diabetes that are described in your book?
I think this is an underappreciated chapter. It sounds like, boring. I know this stuff, but everyone's got to have that foundation of knowledge in order to get to the more advanced stuff. It's like, you can't do algebra and trigonometry until you can do basic arithmetic.
True.
And, you can't, be a Michael Jordan until you learn just how to dribble and shoot a basketball. Yeah. So here come the sports analogies. So having a good solid foundation on the basics is pretty important. And even for those of us who have been dealing with it a long time, that refresher helps, kind of reminds us and gets us set for what's to come.
Especially when things get off track. Sometimes that's the answer, is to go back to the basic information and basic knowledge base that maybe some people, even if you've had diabetes long enough, you might not have learned this information because some of the info wasn't available, or it may have changed. Or if you're like me, there's some things I've learned that just go away and have to learn them again. It's also the case.
Very true. Very true. And some of the things we were taught early on may not have been correct, or maybe we didn't learn them exactly right. And it helps to get the straight facts now. So as far as the types of diabetes, I use ice cream analogies in the book, but we've got several different types of diabetes. And we find now is many of them sort of morph into each other. Type 1 and type 2 are the most common forms. Type 1 diabetes is caused by an autoimmune defect where the body's own immune system destroys the beta cells of the pancreas and renders us unable to produce insulin. And it's so interesting because these beta cells of the pancreas are surrounded with other types of cells called alpha and delta cells. But the immune system leaves those cells alone. It only attacks the beta cells. It's very picky. But we need those beta cells to produce insulin as needed. And without that, That's how type 1 diabetes develops. Now, some people in early stages of type 1 diabetes don't require much insulin. They can survive on either small doses or none at all. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have type 1 yet. As soon as the autoimmune attack begins, they have type 1, and it's going to progress at some point. There's a form of type 1 that I call diabetes light, and it's referred to as LADA, L-A-D-A, latent autoimmune diabetes of adulthood. This is a form of type 1 that's kind of an incomplete form, where the immune attack is very slow and gradual and might take many, many years until a person becomes symptomatic from high blood sugar and requires substantial amounts of insulin. So LADA can be measured in ways that are different than type 1, but managing it is generally a lot easier than having full insulin deficient type 1 diabetes. So type 2 is a very different beast. Type 2 diabetes is not caused by the body's immune system destroying beta cells. The root cause of type 2 diabetes is something called insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, I describe in the book, it's sort of like having a window unit air conditioner in your house on a real hot, muggy day. It just struggles to get the job done. In the diabetes case, your pancreas is putting out insulin, but there's so much working against the insulin that it's not keeping the blood sugars close to normal. And what happens to an air conditioner that's running day after day, 24/7, it burns out. Eventually, it can't even blow cold air. It's just maybe blowing cool air.
Right.
And that's what happens in type 2. What starts out as just a relative lack of insulin and insulin resistance ends up being a pancreas that really can't produce much insulin at all. So type 2 is a progressive condition. It starts out, sort of relatively easy to manage with lifestyle changes, maybe some medications, but it tends to progress and become more challenging to manage over time. And there's sort of a subsidiary of type 2 called gestational diabetes. This is a form of insulin resistance that occurs specifically during pregnancy. During pregnancy, because there is weight gain taking place and the placenta that's nourishing the baby also produces hormones that cause insulin resistance. So during pregnancy, it's not uncommon for significant insulin resistance to occur and for diabetes to develop. And sometimes that requires insulin, sometimes it requires meds or lifestyle changes, but insulin is usually used in gestational diabetes to manage it. So those are the major flavors of diabetes, if you will, that affect most people. But they're discovering even subsets of each of those on a regular basis, and scientists are discovering ways to measure chemicals in the bloodstream that might indicate exactly what form of diabetes you have. But does it really matter when you think about it? When you got diabetes, Tavia, what's important?
How you get your blood sugars managed in a healthy way. There are a variety of options, and then what might be most effective is also of importance. So you're not doing things at your diabetes that are just never going to work, then waste time and money at the pharmacy and frustration.
Yeah. A lot of people who have type 1 diabetes are mistakenly diagnosed with type 2 because they're diagnosed in adulthood, or they may have the physical appearance of someone who has type 2 because perhaps they're obese, a member of a certain ethnic minority group. But medications that stimulate the pancreas are not going to help someone with type 1. That's what we call beating a dead horse. It's just not going to matter.
Right.
So, to some extent, it's important. And also, people with type 2 are very unlikely to end up in ketoacidosis ever because they still can make some insulin. And that doesn't tend to happen unless somebody is completely insulin deficient. So, to some extent, it helps a little bit to know what form you have. But like you said, what really matters is how you manage it and to manage it.
Right. Yeah. And the fact that it changes over time. You mentioned even with, for example, an early LADA diagnosis, maybe no medication or some insulin, but not the normal amounts of and types of insulin that someone with, say, long-standing type 1 diabetes might need. In the beginning, that's true, but over time, some people with LADA end up needing the same amounts of insulin as someone with type 1, normal, younger onset or teenage onset or young adulthood onset, type 1, for example, but some never do. So there's such a variety of insulin production inside of each subset of types of diabetes that you can't even really just guess what type of diabetes somebody has sometimes when you're looking at their data or learning about what medications they're taking. So sometimes how do they distinguish? Like, what are some things that can be done to try to get an answer? What kind of diabetes is this?
One of the most common things we do if we suspect type 1 may be occurring is measure antibodies in the bloodstream. That's usually a surefire way to know if type 1 diabetes has developed or is in process of developing. You can also sort of tell by the amount of insulin someone requires. And there are typical amounts based on body weight. And if somebody requires a lot more than that, then they're very insulin resistant, and there's type 2 is present. But don't forget, you can have more than one form of diabetes at the same time. A lot of people with type 1 become insulin resistant because of weight gain, because of stress, because of inadequate sleep, or because of a family history of type 2, which can contribute to it. And you can have type 1 and become insulin resistant like type 2 diabetes is, and have both at the same time. So it's not always a clear division between them. But like you said, managing it is really the key. When I describe what's involved in managing diabetes, I compare it to a tightrope walker who's trying to balance things, has his arms stretched out and is trying to balance things in both hands. You have things on one side that are raising your glucose, and the other hand are things that are lowering it. And you're trying to walk this tightrope with these things in your hands and not fall into a pit of doom. It's not an easy thing to do. But when you think about the major things that raise and lower blood sugars, what comes to mind?
We already hinted at one, which is insulin, like how much insulin someone is able to produce or what insulin they're taking in as part of their therapy. And you mentioned another earlier, which is weight and insulin resistance. Now that sort of leans into one of those kind of most important components of well-managed diabetes and overall good health, which is how much physical activity and what types and how often someone is performing or doing in order to keep their diabetes well managed. And I think about food. Everybody thinks about food. That's the first one. Whenever someone is newly diagnosed, that's usually what pops into their mind first is, what about food, right? But you mentioned a few others, Gary. You mentioned sleep and stress hormones. What else might we want to be thinking about that are maybe not of equal influence on glucoses, but are still pretty important aside from insulin, activity, food?
Our body produces stress hormones for a lot of different things. Now, certainly for emotional type stresses, we can produce stress hormones. We all experience stress in our lives from different things. And the stress hormones are something that raise blood sugar levels. This is part of the old fight or flight reaction that kept our caveman and cavewoman ancestors alive, was the ability to either fight or outrun a wild animal. And those stress hormones were integral to that. You know, if a bear suddenly rushed at you, you want that jolt of energy to be able to run as fast as you can and get away, maybe climb the highest tree you can find. And those stress hormones give you that power. The stress hormones raise your heart rate, your blood pressure. They make your eyes focus better. You can breathe faster, but also your blood sugar goes up. That's the energy that your body needs to outrun the bear. When you don't have diabetes, the extra energy is put to good use. But when you have diabetes, that extra sugar just raises your glucose level. So stress is something that drives blood sugars up. It's one of the main factors that raises glucose levels. And there's a certain amount of stress hormone we make all the time, but certain situations like emotional stresses, illnesses like surgeries, even physical states like dehydration can cause stress hormone production, sunburn can cause it. There's all kinds of situations where our body's producing stress hormones and it's affecting our glucose levels.
The morning commute might be one for some people.
A morning commute could do that. How long? You work from home. What kind of commute have you got?
I said for some people. My morning commute is pretty relaxing.
Yeah. I work in an office, but my morning commute is only 8 minutes.
Oh, that's pretty good.
However, there's this one traffic light, and it's a long light, and if I don't make it, my commute becomes 9 minutes. That sets me off. There's stress hormones, right? All right. So the stress hormones are one of the major players raising glucose. And then you mentioned food. We all know that carbohydrates are the primary thing in food that raise blood sugar levels. And it doesn't matter if we're consuming sugar or starch, it all turns into glucose and contributes to a blood sugar rise. Even protein can raise blood sugar under special circumstances. Like people who don't eat much carbohydrate are going to convert some of the protein they eat into glucose. That's one of the processes of the liver, just to provide us with the fuel that we need. So without much carb in the diet, protein can raise it. And dietary fat can also affect glucose levels, but in an indirect way. When we have a lot of fats in our meals, it causes a little bit of extra insulin resistance in the body. So it's like getting type 2 diabetes for a short while, and that can raise blood sugar. So we have all the stress hormones and all the things we eat on one side of the scale. And then on the other side of the scale of this balancing act, you mentioned physical activity. Most forms of physical activity will send glucose down, particularly aerobic, cardiovascular kinds of activities. There are some activities that can cause the body to also make stress hormones, though. Like heavy competition, sprinting, fighting, bursts of energy. Those types of activities, we may not see the blood sugar drop much, but that's because of the balance between the stress hormones and the muscles burning energy. But physical activity will always burn some glucose, so it will contribute to a certain extent to a drop in the blood sugar. And then the final variable is the insulin. The insulin is going to lower blood sugar. It is the most potent, direct, and natural way we have to lower blood sugar levels. There are, I think, 11 different classes of diabetes medications. The only one that is truly natural is insulin. All of the other ones are derived and chemically produced, et cetera. But the insulins that we take, they're pretty much the same as the insulin the pancreas makes. Some don't work as quickly as the insulin the pancreas makes, but it's the same basic molecule we're talking about. So in the book, I go through the different types of insulin that are available. We have the long-acting insulins that we call basal insulin. And you know that what's the purpose of basal insulin?
Okay, contrary to common belief, this is something I hear a lot of people say is, I think my basal is good because I wake up with a good number. It doesn't matter what I go to bed with. It brings me down to a good number overnight. Sometimes I wake up with lows in the middle of the night, though. So in contrast to that thought, basal insulin, the purpose of basal insulin is to take care of the sugar that your liver and muscles are putting out every few minutes around the clock when you are not eating food. And if your basal is set appropriately, whether it's a basal rate in a pump or if it's the injected basal that you're taking, your glucose should remain relatively flat or stable over long periods of time when you are not physically active or eating. It should not be your glucose is up and you take enough basal to drop it to target. That's inappropriate. It's risky. Can cause severe lows if you wait too long to eat or if you don't go to bed with a high enough blood sugar or something.
You had me when you said the liver. The basal insulin is just, like you said, it's offsetting the glucose that our liver is producing for us night and day, a little bit from the muscles as well. But you're right. Anybody with type 1 diabetes should set their basal insulin doses to keep their blood sugars steady, not to rise or fall. People with type 2 diabetes who still make some of their own, it's a little different. Then the dose of basal insulin they take, we want them waking up close to normal, regardless of what they were at bedtime. But if you have type 1, or if you have type 2 and don't make any insulin anymore, basal's job is stability. When you haven't eaten for a while, haven't taken any rapid insulin for a while, and you're not exercising, that basal insulin should keep you nice and flat. And then we have the mealtime or rapid-acting insulin, which we collectively refer to as bolus insulin. So I remember to eat a bowl of food, so bolus is for food. And the basal is like a baseline, a base in baseball. It's flat. So that's the difference. And bolus insulin comes in a number of varieties as well. Some are faster than others. And we try to match the absorption of food as closely as possible in determining, when and what kind of mealtime bolus insulin to take. I always thought the name rapid acting was not funny, but kind of illegal. They shouldn't be able to call Humalog and Novolog and NovoRapid rapid acting because they're not. When the pancreas makes insulin, it works in seconds. The rapid insulins we take hours to work. So they're not rapid acting. But there are some insulins that are a little more rapid than rapid acting, and those can work effectively as well.
Now that you've talked about a little bit about basal and bolus insulin, can you tell us a little bit more about how insulin actually works in the body? What's it doing in there?
I wish we could just take a camera and know, and make a video and know exactly. But what we understand about insulin is that it operates kind of like a key. Think of your body's cells. Your body's made of billions of cells. They're sealed off. And in order for sugar or glucose to get into the cell and be burned for fuel, you have to open a little door. Sugar's a big molecule, doesn't just float into the cell. These doors have to be opened. And insulin is a very specially designed key that goes from cell to cell, opening up doors. So it's essential to have insulin present in order for glucose to get out of the bloodstream and into the cells where it's burned for energy. So in a nutshell, that's how insulin works. If insulin is not present, then the sugar can't get out of the blood and into the cells. The cells starve for fuel and the blood sugar level goes much too high. And when you don't make any insulin at all, as is the case in type 1 diabetes, that's what happens. In type 2 diabetes, you got keys, you got insulin floating around. The problem is the key's having a hard time opening the doors. If you've ever tried to open a door with a key that didn't fit exactly right, and you jiggle and it still doesn't open, but sometimes it does open, that's type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
That's resistance to the keys. The keys just aren't able to do the job the way they should. And the blood sugar level ends up being higher than it should be.
So let's say somebody starts taking insulin. They worked with their healthcare team. They're taking basal insulin for their overnight and in between meal coverage, taking bolus insulin for their meal times. What else needs to go into ensuring that the doses are safe? Or how do you know when something isn't ideal? What do you need to do if things are out of whack with all that insulin dosing?
That's what monitoring is all about. Whether you use a continuous glucose monitor or a finger stick meter, looking at that data, you'll be able to see if your glucose is staying in a healthy range, and not just first thing in the morning, but before meals, after meals, and trying to stay in your target glucose zone as much as possible is what we're trying to accomplish. Now, insulin isn't the only option as far as medications for lowering glucose levels. Like I said, there's 11 different classes of medications, and within each class, there are different drugs that can be used. Nowadays, people with type 1 diabetes are often using medications that were designed for type 2s, but can still benefit people with type 1. One of the oldest meds is called metformin. Metformin is a generic pill that suppresses how much sugar the liver is producing. And that helps not just reduce insulin requirements, but also helps reduce insulin resistance. So that's one that a lot of people use who are on very high doses of insulin. We're often using GLP-1 medications, which help us control our appetite and stay on a better meal plan. And there's other side benefits to use of those in terms of slowing digestion, improving heart health, kidney health, central nervous system. There's a lot of benefits we're seeing with these meds. There's another class of medications called SGLT2 inhibitors. These are pills that allow the kidneys to excrete sugar in the urine so that the glucose is being reduced constantly in a natural, passive way. There's some risk in using those, but if people are properly trained on how to avoid ketoacidosis, they can be used pretty safely. So chapter 3 gets into the details about all of the medications, the advantages, the drawbacks, the side effects, who might benefit, and it goes into the different insulin options, as well as some more detail about the nature of food and looking at the carbohydrates and how to count those and how different physical activities and stresses can influence us. So it's really kind of a putting it all together chapter for anybody who wants to just take a step back and make sure they know the basics so that they can effectively manage their diabetes.
Like I said, it sounds like one of the most important chapters of the book, because if you don't have that baseline understanding of even just basal versus bolus insulin, you're in for a wild and confusing ride. It doesn't have to be as confusing and as stressful if you have the basics down pat. Now, in some of the other chapters, you're going to get into some more detail about some of the variables and factors that influence blood sugars and what to do about it, like with physical activity and food and so forth. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We have entire chapters dedicated to setting up the insulin program and fine-tuning the doses. And throughout all of that is discussion about the role of physical activity in different situations and scenarios where the blood sugar might go down, might go up, might go down in a delayed manner. A lot of different combinations that can occur. In the real world, we see these sorts of things. So that's why they're covered. And yeah, the rest of the book is building on chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the foundation, and everything else builds off of that.
And I think the other important piece for chapter 3 is, just while we're on the topic, and hopefully this gets mentioned almost every chapter you review, the point of understanding this information and obtaining it and using it in your own personal diabetes is to continue to do your best with the options that you have available and continue to learn, continue to try new things that are right for your diabetes, working with your healthcare team or with great resources like Integrated Diabetes Services to help you minimize those glucose variables that do come up with living real life with the type of diabetes that you are contending with. And no one has perfect diabetes. If they do, then they have the quote unquote light version, right? If you're not making any insulin or making very little insulin, there are just an almost infinite list of possibilities of what might be influencing your blood sugar in the moment. So getting adequate help and support to fine tune your insulin therapy and your medication therapy is highly recommended. Of course, I might be biased because that's what I do all day, but seeing people at the beginning of our visits to where they get to over time and achieving their glucose management targets, understanding their diabetes and their medications, and being able to apply what they've learned in different situations like illness or travel or giving a large presentation in front of an auditorium, who knows what it is. Really, there's nothing like it, being able to work with people and help them get to those stages in life.
That's why we do what we do at Integrated Diabetes Services.
It is. And I think this is probably a great place to wrap up for today's chapter review of Gary's Think Like a Pancreas book, chapter 3. We hope you enjoyed your time with us and look forward to upcoming chapters that we will be going through. It might not be me as your host, but you will get to interact with others on our fantastic team as we work through the rest of the book.
Thanks for tuning in to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. On behalf of Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, I'm Gary Scheiner, wishing you a fantastic week ahead. And don't forget to think like a pancreas.